The Suez Canal is a man-made waterway in Egypt. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Before it was built, ships traveling from Europe to Asia had to sail all the way around Africa. This long journey took many weeks and was very expensive. The canal, which opened in 1869, changed everything. It created a much shorter, faster route. Suddenly, trade and travel between the East and the West became easier than ever before. This incredible feat of engineering became one of the most important shipping lanes in the entire world, a vital artery for global commerce that transformed international relations. For the British Empire, the Suez Canal was more than just a convenient shortcut. It was the lifeline of the empire. Britain had vast territories in Asia, including the jewel in its crown, India. The canal allowed the British to move troops, supplies and goods to and from these colonies quickly and efficiently. It was essential for maintaining control and projecting power across its global domain. Losing access to the canal would mean a return to the long, slow voyage around the African continent, which would weaken Britain's military and economic grip on its eastern possessions. Control of the canal was, therefore, a matter of national security and imperial prestige. Britain's involvement in Egypt deepened because of the canal's importance. The company that built and operated the canal was originally French, but in 1875, the British government cleverly bought a massive stake in it from Egypt's ruler. This gave Britain significant influence over this strategic waterway. To protect its investment and ensure the canal remained open to its ships, Britain eventually occupied Egypt in 1882. For decades, British troops were stationed in the country, particularly in the Canal Zone. This presence ensured that the canal, the empire's main artery, remained firmly under British control, a symbol of its global dominance. By the middle of the 20th century, the world was changing rapidly. The age of empires was coming to an end. Many countries were demanding their independence from colonial rule. In Egypt, a wave of nationalism was rising. The Egyptian people grew to resent the British troops stationed on their soil. They saw the foreign control of their most valuable asset, the Suez Canal, as a national humiliation. This growing anger and desire for true independence set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. The days of Britain's unchallenged authority in the region were numbered, and a major crisis was brewing just over the horizon. In 1952, a revolution in Egypt overthrew the monarchy. A new leader emerged, a charismatic and determined army officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was a strong Arab nationalist. He dreamed of a modern, independent Egypt, free from foreign influence. He wanted to end the British military presence and take back control of the Suez Canal for the Egyptian people. Nasser's vision was not just for Egypt. He wanted to lead the entire Arab world. His powerful speeches and bold actions made him a hero to many Arabs, but a dangerous figure in the eyes of the old colonial powers like Britain and France. The trigger for the crisis came from a dam. Nasser had a grand plan to build the Aswan High Dam on the River Nile. This project was enormous and expensive. It was designed to provide electricity for the whole country and control the river's annual floods, which would help agriculture. To fund this massive undertaking, Nasser sought help from the United States and Britain. However, they became worried about his growing ties to the Soviet Union and his nationalist policies. In July 1956, the Americans and British suddenly withdrew their offer of funding for the dam, a move they thought would chasten the Egyptian leader. Nasser's response was swift, dramatic, and defiant. Just 1 week after the funding was pulled, he stood before a massive crowd in Alexandria and delivered a fiery speech. He announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. This meant the Egyptian government was taking full control of the waterway from the private, foreign-owned company that had run it for nearly a century. He declared that the fees from ships using the canal would now be used to pay for the Aswan High Dam. The news was met with wild celebrations in Egypt but caused shock and outrage in London and Paris. For British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, Nasser's action was a direct challenge that could not be ignored. He saw Nasser as another dictator, comparing him to Mussolini and Hitler, who had to be stopped. France was also furious. They believed Nasser was supporting rebels who were fighting against French rule in Algeria. Convinced that diplomacy was useless, Britain and France began to plot in secret. They reached out to another of Nasser's enemies, Israel. Together, the three nations hatched a secret plan to take back the canal by force, an audacious and risky military operation that would have global consequences. The secret plan was put into action on 29 October 1956. As agreed, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt, sending its forces across the Sinai Peninsula towards the Suez Canal. This was the first stage of the conspiracy. The Israeli invasion was intended to look like an act of aggression that threatened the stability of the entire region and the safety of the canal. It provided the perfect pretext for Britain and France to intervene. Their hidden goal was not to separate the warring sides, but to use the conflict as a cover to seize the canal and, if possible, topple Nasser from power. Playing their part in the pre-arranged script, Britain and France issued an ultimatum. They demanded that both Israeli and Egyptian forces withdraw from the area around the canal. They knew, of course, that Nasser would never agree to pull his troops back from his own country's sovereign territory. It was a demand designed to be rejected. When Nasser, as expected, refused the ultimatum, the two European powers had the excuse they needed to launch their own military operation. On 31 October, British and French bombers began attacking Egyptian airfields, destroying most of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. A few days later, on 5 November, British and French paratroopers were dropped into the canal zone, capturing key positions around Port Said. An amphibious landing followed, with thousands of troops coming ashore. Militarily, the operation was a success. The Anglo-French forces quickly overwhelmed the Egyptian defenders and took control of the northern end of the canal. They were poised to advance south and seize the entire waterway. It seemed as though their bold and secretive plan was working perfectly. They had achieved their initial military objectives with speed and efficiency, but they had fatally miscalculated the international political reaction. The invasion caused a storm of outrage around the world. The United States, Britain's most important ally, was furious. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had not been consulted about the secret plan and felt betrayed. He saw the invasion as a desperate act of old-world colonialism that could push the Arab nations towards the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in turn, saw an opportunity. It condemned the attack and made thinly veiled threats of rocket strikes against London and Paris. The United Nations overwhelmingly voted to condemn the invasion, leaving Britain, France, and Israel completely isolated on the world stage. The international pressure, especially from the United States, was immense and unbearable for Britain. President Eisenhower was determined to stop the invasion. He used America's powerful financial leverage to force Britain's hand. The United States government began to sell its holdings of the British pound sterling, causing a currency crisis. The value of the pound plummeted, and Britain's economy was suddenly on the verge of collapse. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was faced with a stark choice: either stop the invasion immediately or face complete financial ruin. The economic threat was far more powerful than any military opposition. Humiliated and with no other option, Eden buckled under the pressure. On 6 November, just a day after the main landings, he announced a ceasefire. The British and French forces were ordered to halt their advance, stopping just 23 miles south of Port Said. They had failed to seize the entire canal. Soon after, they were forced to agree to a humiliating withdrawal, to be replaced by a United Nations peacekeeping force. The invasion had lasted just over a week and had ended in a complete political disaster. Nasser, despite his military defeat, emerged as a political victor and a hero across the Arab world for having stood up to the old imperial powers. The consequences for Britain were devastating. The Suez Crisis exposed the reality that Britain was no longer a top-tier world power. It could no longer act independently on the world stage without the approval of the United States. The crisis shattered the illusion of British global dominance that had lingered since the days of empire. Anthony Eden's political career was destroyed. He resigned in disgrace a few months later. The event forced a painful reassessment of Britain's place in the world. The country had to accept its new reduced role as a junior partner to the rising American superpower. The Suez Crisis is a landmark event in modern British history. It marks the moment when the nation's fall from imperial grace became undeniable. It accelerated the end of the British Empire as the government realised it could no longer afford to maintain its global commitments. The crisis taught a harsh lesson. Military strength meant little without economic power and the support of key allies. It forced Britain to turn its focus away from its old empire and towards a new future, one that would eventually lie with Europe. The Suez Crisis was the final, painful curtain call on Britain's century of imperial greatness.